The first time I saw Gale Acevedo, I decided I didn't like him. That's not the most romantic opening to a love story, I know. But if you want the truth, and I've spent enough of my life running from the truth that I owe it to myself to stop now. That's exactly how it happened. One look at him, standing in the doorway of our shared office on my first day at Renwick Publishing, and something in my chest locked up tight, like a door being bolted from the inside. He was laughing at something someone had said. His head was thrown back, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe for balance, and the sound of it, his laugh, cut right through the low morning hum of the office. Warm, unguarded, the kind of laugh that makes strangers smile without knowing why. I didn't smile. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder and walked the other way. My name is Jeremy Lowry. I was 26 years old when I started at Renwick, freshly relocated from a city I'd spent 3 years trying to make feel like home and failing at, carrying 2 suitcases and a very specific list of things I was not going to do. I was not going to make close friends. I was not going to get attached to a place. I was not going to let anyone get close enough to matter, because things that matter have a way of disappearing, and I was so tired of watching things disappear. It was a clean, simple system. It had worked for 3 years. I was very proud of it. Gale Acevedo destroyed it in approximately 4 months. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain the office setup, because it matters. Renwick Publishing was a mid-sized independent house, the kind with exposed brick walls and an overworked espresso machine and editors who had opinions about typefaces that bordered on religious conviction. I was hired as a junior acquisitions editor, which meant I read manuscripts all day and wrote reports on them, which suited me perfectly because manuscripts don't talk back. Gale was a senior editor. He'd been there 4 years already. He was 29, which I found out later, though I spent the first 2 weeks assuming he was at least 32 because of the way he moved through the office. Not like he owned it. Nothing so aggressive as that, but like he was genuinely comfortable there. Like he belonged somewhere. I found that deeply suspicious. We were assigned adjacent desks because the office was small, and that was simply where the empty desk happened to be. I set up my space with careful economy. A laptop, a small succulent that I kept mostly as a test of my own reliability. A single framed photo that I kept face down. Gale, on the other hand, had covered his desk in what I could only describe as organized chaos. There were stacks of manuscripts with color-coded tabs, a coffee mug that said something in a language I didn't recognize, 2 small figurines of animals, a fox and a bear, sitting on top of his monitor, post-it notes in 4 different colors, each apparently serving a different categorical function that he had explained to no one. He caught me looking at the fox figurine on my 3rd day. "That's Theo," he said, not looking up from his screen. "The bear is Winston." I turned back to my own screen. I wasn't asking. I know. I was just telling you. That was the thing about Gale that I found most irritating in those early weeks. He had this quality of offering information without requiring anything in return. He didn't seem to need me to respond, or to be interested, or to reciprocate. He would just say things, small, random, ordinary things, and then go back to whatever he was doing, as if the act of saying them was complete in itself, regardless of whether anyone received them. It felt, to me, like a trap. Like he was laying a trail of breadcrumbs, and if I followed even one of them, I'd find myself somewhere I hadn't planned to be. So I didn't follow any of them. I gave short answers. I kept my headphones in when I could. I was polite in meetings because I'm not actually rude, just careful, and there's a difference. I said good morning and good evening, and please and thank you, and I kept everything exactly at the surface temperature of professional courtesy. And Gale, this is the part that used to infuriate me and now makes my chest ache when I think about it. Gale was perfectly, genuinely kind about all of it. He didn't push. He didn't take my coolness personally, or if he did, he never showed it. He just continued being himself, easy and warm and present, like a lamp left on in a room you've decided not to enter. Week 3, he brought coffee to my desk without asking. "You were here before me and your mug is empty," he said, setting a paper cup down beside my keyboard. "The machine is temperamental after 8 mun, so I grabbed it on my way in." I looked at the cup, then at him. He was already walking back to his own desk. "You didn't ask how I take it," I said. "Americano with a splash of cold water, so it's drinkable immediately." "You make a face at anything with milk in it, And you've never used the sugar bowl. He sat down and opened his laptop. I stared at the back of his head for a full 5 seconds, trying to identify which category of boundary violation this fell into. The coffee was exactly right. I drank it. I didn't say thank you, which I'm not proud of. I told myself it was because I didn't want to encourage the behavior. What I was actually doing, though I wouldn't have admitted it under any circumstances, was protecting myself from the warmth of the gesture, from the specific discomfort of being seen accurately by someone I had decided not to let see me at all. That night, I went home and moved the face-down photo to the inside of my desk drawer. I don't know why. I didn't examine the impulse too closely. The first real conversation we had, not an exchange about manuscript logistics or office schedules, but an actual conversation, happened by accident, the way most important things in my life have happened. It was a Thursday evening in October, and I'd stayed late to finish a report on a submission I'd been wrestling with for days. The office had emptied out by 7. I'd thought I was alone, which was how I preferred it. The building had a different quality at night, quieter and more honest somehow. The fluorescent lights replaced by the warmer overheads that the last person out always switched on. I was standing at the window with my third cup of coffee looking out at the street below when I heard a door and turned to find Gail coming out of the small archive room at the back, carrying a box of old galleys and looking surprised to see me. "You're still here," he said. "So are you." He set the box down on the edge of his desk and rolled his neck. I lost track of time. "There's a project I'm doing, a retrospective on one of our authors from the early years. It's not official work technically, just something I want to do." Something in me, against my better judgment, said, "Which author?" He looked at me. Not surprised exactly, but something adjacent to it, attentive, like he was noting something. "Mira Halverson. Do you know her work?" I did. Mira Halverson had written 3 novels in the late 90s that I had read at 17, sitting in a library after school because I didn't want to go home. And those 3 novels had been the first time I'd understood that loneliness could be written about in a way that didn't make you feel more alone. "A little," I said. She stopped writing after her 3rd book. Gale sat on the edge of his desk. "There are letters in the archive from her to the original editor here. I've been reading them. It's complicated. She was brilliant, and she was exhausted, and she was afraid. And all 3 of those things were tangled up together. I keep thinking about that." I turned back to the window. Outside, a couple was walking a large dog that kept stopping to investigate every lamppost. "What do you think about it?" "That we don't talk enough about what it costs," he said. "Creating things, putting parts of yourself into work that other people then get to have opinions about. I think Mira Halverson got tired of paying the cost, and I think everyone around her thought it was just a block, a phase, something to push through, and nobody asked whether the cost was actually worth it anymore." I was quiet for a moment. The couple outside had finally convinced the dog to move on. "That's a generous reading, maybe. I think generous is usually closer to true than ungenerous, though. What do you think?" Nobody had asked me what I thought in a conversation like this, unguarded, unhurried, in a very long time, maybe longer than I wanted to calculate. I felt the question land somewhere that had gotten used to not being touched. "I think she was probably right to stop," I said carefully. "If the thing was taking more than it was giving." Gale nodded slowly, looking at the box of galleys. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." We stood in the quiet office for a moment, not filling it, and it was the first time in 3 weeks of proximity that the air between us felt entirely comfortable. That frightened me considerably. I picked up my bag and said goodnight and left. On the train home, I caught myself thinking about the fox on his desk. Theo, he'd named it, which was an absurd and endearing thing to do, and I made myself stop. October became November. November in this city arrives with a specific quality of gray, not depressing exactly, but serious, like the sky has things on its mind. I started wearing a heavier coat. The office got the particular coziness of a heated interior against cold windows, and people brought in blankets for their chairs, and there was almost always something baking in the kitchen down the hall, because one of the rights managers had stress-baking tendencies that peaked in cold weather. Gail and I had settled into something, not friendship. I was specific about that internally, like a scientist maintaining a control condition, but not pure professional distance either, because that ship had sailed somewhat on the Thursday of the archive room and the Mira Halverson conversation. It was something in between, a kind of careful familiarity. We knew each other's coffee. We had a running low-level commentary on the more bewildering manuscripts that came through, delivered in quiet asides during meetings, which made the meetings bearable. He knew I liked the window seat. I knew he always forgot to charge his phone and kept a cable in 4 different locations as a system he called redundancy planning, and I privately found chaotic but effective. I had reclassified him in my internal system. He was no longer suspicious. He was acceptable, present, someone I could be in a room with without expending significant energy managing the distance. This was, I see now, already a form of losing. The thing that cracked the next layer happened in late November, at the company's end-of-year dinner, which I had planned to attend for exactly 1 hour before developing a headache and leaving. The dinner was at a restaurant that was nicer than our usual haunts, with low lighting and a private room, and the kind of menu where the portions are artistic and you end up hungry afterward. I sat at the far end of the long table, which positioned me conveniently near the door. Gale ended up seated beside me because the seating was assigned, and this was apparently where we were. He looked at the arrangement, then at me, and said, "You've already planned your exit, haven't you?" "I don't know what you mean. You're 3 feet from the door, your jacket is on the back of your chair instead of the hook by the entrance, and you checked your phone twice before we sat down." I felt my face do something involuntary. "That's very observant of you." "You're easy to observe," he said, not unkindly. "You think you're invisible, but you're one of the most legible people I've ever met." That landed in a way that I didn't have an immediate response to. Legible. I had spent years working very hard to be the opposite. That seems like an exaggeration. "Maybe," he said in the tone that meant he didn't actually think so. The dinner happened around us. I stayed longer than an hour. I'm not entirely sure why. The food was better than expected, and Gale turned out to be excellent company in a specific way that I hadn't previously allowed myself to notice. The kind of person who listens to what you actually say rather than waiting for his turn to talk. We ended up in a conversation about music of all things, which started when someone at the table mentioned a band, and Gale made a face that I correctly identified as politely concealed disagreement, and I said quietly, "You don't like them." And he said, "They're fine. I just think people confuse technical proficiency for actual emotional resonance." And I said, "That's a very precise criticism." And he said, "Do you agree?" And I said, "Yes." And we were off. We talked about music, and then about how music works in film, and then about a specific film that we had both apparently seen at formative ages and had very different relationships to. And by the time the dessert course arrived, I had forgotten entirely about the door 3 feet away. I was turned toward him without having decided to turn. He was turned toward me, his elbow on the table, comfortable in the way he always was, but with something more concentrated in his attention that I noticed and then looked away from, walking out into the cold night air after. The group dispersing in different directions, I experienced a confusion that I initially identified as the wine. 1 glass, nothing dramatic, before admitting to myself that it wasn't the wine. It was the evening. It was the conversation and the way it had felt effortless, in a way that most conversations didn't feel for me, and the specific quality of Gale's attention, which was something I had been carefully not examining for 2 months, and which I could no longer pretend I hadn't noticed. On the walk to the train, I rebuilt my argument. I did not want this. I was not doing this. Whatever this was, interest, warmth, the beginning of something that had edges I couldn't see, I was not following it. I had a system. My system worked. I went home. I lay in the dark for an hour and a half before I fell asleep. I dreamed about the fox figurine, which I chose not to interpret. December arrived, and with it a kind of tautness in my interactions with Gale that hadn't been there before. I had recalibrated. I was more careful again. Shorter answers, fewer asides, a reestablishment of surface temperature. I told myself this was maintenance, not retreat. A rational recalibration based on updated information about where the edges of comfortable were. Gale noticed. Of course he noticed. He was the most perceptive person I had ever encountered at close range, which was part of the problem. He didn't say anything for a week. He was respectful in that way. Patient, in a way that felt less like passivity and more like a quiet, steady kind of confidence, like someone who knew that a door they'd knocked on was going to open eventually and was simply willing to wait. I found this, in my recalibrated state, irritating in a new and specific way. The second week, he said, "You've gotten quiet." We were both at our desks. I didn't look up. I'm working. You're always working. You were also talking to me before. People have varying conversational output day to day. A pause. Then, Jeremy. The way he said my name, I don't know how to explain this without sounding like I've lost my mind, but there was something about the way Gail said my name that was different from the way other people said it. Most people say a name like a label, a way of getting your attention. Gail said it like it was something he'd thought about, like it meant something specific to him. I kept my eyes on my screen. What? Did I do something? No. Are you sure? Yes. He was quiet. I heard him turn back to his work, and I felt in the silence that followed something ugly and small move through me, a relief that the conversation was over, and underneath it, layer by layer, a shame that I'd ended it, and underneath that, something I didn't want to name at all. The fracture, the real one, the one I still think about with a specific quality of regret, happened on the 15th of December. There was a manuscript on my desk that I'd been reporting on for 3 days, a novel called The Compass and the Crow by a first-time writer. It was a love story. 2 men, a slow build over 300 pages, full of the kind of quiet longing that's harder to write than the dramatic kind. I had been writing a recommendation for acquisition, the strongest I'd written since joining Renwick, and I had stayed late to finish it. I didn't know Gale had been asked to do a second read of the same manuscript. He came to my desk around 6:30 after most people had left, holding his own copy. I wanted to compare notes, he said, on the Vasquez submission. That was the author's name. I had my report open on my screen. Sure. He sat in the empty chair beside my desk. There was one, a battered blue thing that visiting editors sometimes used, and put his copy on the corner of my desk. What's your take? Strong recommendation. The pacing in the second act has problems, but they're solvable. The emotional core is genuine. Gale nodded. Same read. I kept thinking about the scene in chapter 12, where Daniel is watching Marcus leave, and he knows exactly what he feels, and he still doesn't say anything. The restraint of it. My jaw tightened without my permission. What about it? I thought it was the most honest part of the book, that specific kind of paralysis, knowing something and being unable to say it because saying it makes it real, and real things can be lost. The office was quiet. Outside, the December dark had fallen fully, and the window threw back a dim reflection of the room. Both of us, his face half turned toward me, mine angled away. It's an effective scene, I said. Is that all? That's my editorial opinion, yes. Gale was looking at me. I could feel it. Jeremy, I'm not asking as an editor. Something cold moved through me. Then I don't know what you're asking. A long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured, but not quite hiding something underneath it. I think you do. And that was where I made the mistake that I have replayed more times than I can count. I put my pen down on my desk. I turned to look at him, and I let everything I'd been suppressing come out in a single, controlled, devastating sentence. I think you should be careful about projecting things onto professional interactions, Gale. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences. Something in it had a different texture, a different weight. I watched his face. He was good at keeping his expression even, better than most people. But I saw something move through his eyes that I recognized even then, even in the moment I was causing it. He looked down at the manuscript on my desk. He picked it up. He stood. You're right, he said. Apologies. He walked to his desk, gathered his things with the same quiet efficiency he did everything, and left the office. The door didn't slam. It closed with a small, precise click that was somehow worse. I sat there for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I watched the clock on my screen. Then I finished my report, sent it, turned off my monitor, and went home. I told myself I had done the right thing. I had maintained the boundary. I had protected the professional environment. I had been honest. I spent the entire train ride home being very carefully not honest with myself about any of it. The 2 weeks before the holiday break were the longest 2 weeks of my working life, and I've had some genuinely long working weeks. Gale was professional, impeccably, precisely professional, in the way that someone who has been kind to you and then been told, essentially, that the kindness was unwelcome sometimes becomes not cold. That would have been easier somehow. Just distant. A controlled reduction of proximity. He stopped bringing coffee. He stopped the asides in meetings. When we needed to communicate about shared projects, he emailed rather than turning in his chair to say the 3 words it would have taken to convey the same information. I had gotten what I said I wanted. I want to be fair to my past self, because I've spent enough time being harsh to him already. I was not a cruel person. I was not someone who enjoyed causing pain. What I was at 26 in December of that year was someone so comprehensively afraid of loss that I had confused preventing attachment with protecting myself. The logic was, if you don't let anything in, nothing can leave. If nothing leaves, you don't have to survive it leaving. It's watertight, as far as it goes. It's also a very small room to live in. The photo in my desk drawer, the face-down one, the one I'd moved on my 3rd day, was a picture of my brother and me at the beach when I was 16 and he was 13. His name is Daniel. He'd moved across the country with his family 3 years before this story starts. And I know that the reasonable adult interpretation of that is simply that people move, families grow, lives go in different directions. But 16-year-old me, who had spent a lot of years with Daniel as my primary point of stability in an unstable house, had filed it somewhere that still felt like abandonment, even when the reasonable adult part of me knew perfectly well it wasn't. I am telling you this because it's relevant. It's not the whole explanation. I don't believe in reducing people to their damage, including myself, but it's a true piece of it. I went home for the holidays. My parents' house, a drive out of the city. 3 days of careful conversation and the specific exhaustion of people who love each other but have never quite learned how to say so. My mother made too much food. My father and I watched films in companionable near silence. I called Daniel on the 2nd day and we talked for an hour, the easy kind of talking that adults manage once they've rebuilt things after they've broken. And when I hung up, I sat by the window in my childhood bedroom and thought about Gail for a long time. I thought about the coffee he'd made exactly right without asking, about Thea the fox and Winston the bear, about the way he'd said my name, about chapter 12 of The Compass and the Crow, and what he'd said about knowing something and being unable to say it because saying it makes it real and real things can be lost. I thought about the expression on his face when I'd said what I'd said. I picked up my phone and put it down about 7 times before I finally wrote, "I owe you an apology. I'd like to give it properly when we're back if you let me." I sent it before I could talk myself out of it. Then I put the phone, face down, on the windowsill and watched the snow in the yard and tried to breathe. His response came 4 hours later, which was long enough that I'd stopped expecting one. It said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. But I held it like it was something more. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself do that without making myself stop. January. The office after a break has a particular quality. Slightly sheepish, like everyone is a little surprised to be back, trading half-hearted stories about holidays while the coffee machine runs continuously. I arrived early, which was my habit. I set down my bag. The succulent had survived in my absence, which I took as a sign of something without specifying what. Gale arrived at 8:45. He looked the same. He always looked essentially the same. That was one of his qualities, a kind of physical consistency, like the temperature in a well-kept room. Dark hair, light brown eyes, the worn gray sweater he rotated in on cold days. He set down his bag. He turned on his monitor. He looked at me. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," I said. And then, "Are you free at lunch?" A pause. "Yes." "Would you want to get lunch?" A pause. "Yes." "Would you want to get lunch?" Off-site. Another pause, shorter. "Yes." We went to a small place 2 blocks away. Not the usual group lunch spot, but somewhere quieter. We ordered. We sat with our food, and for a moment neither of us said anything, and it was not comfortable, the way silences between us used to be able to be comfortable. It was a different kind of silence, full of pressure, of awareness. I said, "I was unkind to you. In December." What I said was designed to shut the conversation down, and it was unkind and dismissive, and I'm sorry. Gail looked at me steadily. "Thank you for saying that." I want to explain, not to excuse it. I've had a system for a while, keeping people at a certain distance. It's been a very effective system for not being hurt and also for not really being known by anyone, which I've recently been forced to admit is the same system. His expression was unreadable. In a way, his expressions almost never were. I know. You know about the system. I noticed it on your second day. The way you set up your desk, the headphones, the way you calibrate courtesy so it fills exactly the space of politeness without leaving room for anything else. A small pause. I thought it was interesting. Interesting. I thought you were someone who'd gotten hurt and built a very specific architecture around it, and I thought. He stopped. What? His eyes met mine. I thought you were worth the patience. There it was. I sat with it. It landed not like a declaration, but like something gentler and more devastating, a simple statement of a decision he'd already made, without dramatics, without demand. He'd decided I was worth waiting for, and he'd waited, and I had been, for 3 months, systematically not worth it, and he had waited anyway. Gail, I said, and my voice did something I hadn't planned. You don't have to say anything. I want to say something. I'm not good at this part. I know that too, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite warmth and not quite humor, but the specific combination of both that was distinctly his. It's okay. I think I started again, when you left the office in December and the door closed. I sat there for 11 minutes and I wanted to tell you that you'd been completely right about what you were saying, and I didn't say it then, and I've been thinking about it since, and I'm telling you now that you were right about the paralysis, about the knowing. He was very still. I know what I feel, I said, which was the hardest sentence I'd said in 3 years, and I'm saying it now because making it real is terrifying. And also the alternative is continuing to live in a very small room, and I've been in the small room long enough. A long, full moment. Then Gail said quietly, How long have you known? Since October, probably. The Thursday in the office with the archive. I left very quickly afterward. Something moved across his face. Something soft. Something that looked like relief and recognition together. I've known since August, he said, before you even started. I'd read some of your reports from your previous role. The acquisitions team shared them as examples. The way you wrote about books. The way you saw into them. I thought things before I even met you. I stared at him. That's embarrassing, maybe. I was going to say remarkable. A pause. That's the longest head start I've ever given anyone. He laughed. It was the laugh from the doorway on my first day, the one that had cut through the office hum. Except now I was close enough to see what it looked like from the inside. The way his eyes changed the slight furrow of concentration that happiness apparently produced in him. I'd spent 3 months carefully not looking at him laugh, and now I was looking, and it was exactly as dangerous as I'd suspected. So, I said. So, he said. I should tell you, I'm still not good at this. I'm going to be bad at it in specific ways that I can probably predict in advance, and I'll probably retreat sometimes when I shouldn't. And, Jeremy, he said. What? I know. I also know we've been at this table for 40 minutes, and neither of us has touched their food. I looked down. My soup had reached room temperature. Right. Eat your lunch, he said, and then let's go back to work. And then maybe this weekend, if you want, we could try having dinner somewhere that isn't across the street from our office. Something unknotted in my chest. Something I'd been holding so long I'd forgotten what it felt like not to hold it. I'd like that, I said. Good. He picked up his fork. Eat. I ate. I want to tell you about the learning, because this is where most love stories do something dishonest. They get to the moment of declaration and then they skip, or they do a quick montage of happy times, and they let you assume that everything after the admission is easy. It isn't easy. I knew it wouldn't be, and I should tell you exactly how it wasn't and how we handled it anyway, because that's the more useful truth. Our first date was a Saturday in January, a restaurant in the older part of the city that Gail had been to before, and I hadn't. He was there when I arrived at a corner table with his coat on the back of his chair, and when he saw me come in, his face did the thing it did. The concentrated attention, The specific warmth that I had spent months misidentifying as general friendliness and could now correctly identify as directed entirely at me, that was a new thing to sit with, being the object of that attention rather than deflecting it. I won't say I was comfortable, because I wasn't, but I wanted to be there, and that wanting was the whole point. We talked for 3 hours. We closed the restaurant almost by accident, neither of us noticing the chairs being put on tables around us until the waiter apologetically appeared. We split the bill over a brief, low-stakes argument that I was pleased to discover we were both the kind of people to have, and walked out into the January night, and stood on the pavement in front of the restaurant in our separate coats. "This was good," Gail said. "Yes," I said. A pause. "Would you like to do it again?" "Yes," I said with less hesitation than I expected. He smiled. Not the full laugh. Something quieter. The kind of smile that means something specific rather than general. He said goodnight and walked toward his train, and I walked toward mine, and I got approximately 1 block before I stopped and stood on the pavement for a moment, alone in the cold, and did something I hadn't done in a while. I let myself be happy about something. Just stood there and let the fact of the evening be present without immediately filing it away or managing it or bracing for the part where it stopped. Just for 30 seconds approximately. Then the cold got into my coat and I walked on. That is the learning. That's what I mean. It's not a montage. It's standing on a cold street and choosing for 30 seconds to let something be real. The second time I retreated, it was February. We'd been seeing each other for 3 weeks, dinners, a Saturday walk along the waterfront, an afternoon that had started as a bookshop trip and become something longer and warmer and unplanned. Things were good. That, in my particular psychology, was precisely the condition most likely to trigger the retreat, because things being good was the condition under which loss feels most possible. I picked a fight about nothing. That's the honest description. He'd mentioned something offhand about a trip he was planning in March, a long weekend visiting a friend in another city, and I had felt the specific contraction in my chest that I associated with things that were going to leave, and instead of identifying it as the old fear and saying so, I let it out sideways. I said something sharp about his habit of making plans without full information. It was ostensibly about the trip. It was about nothing at all. Gale had put down the menu he was holding and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not hurt, not angry. Thoughtful. Calibrating. "What's actually happening?" he said. "I don't know what you mean." That was about something other than trip planning logistics. I looked at the table, the salt shaker, the texture of the paper tablecloth. "I know," I said after a moment. "Tell me." So I did, haltingly, with multiple false starts, and incomplete sentences that he waited out without finishing for me. I told him about the contraction in my chest and what it meant and where it came from. About Daniel moving away. About the specific logic of my system, which I was aware was not rational but which was also not nothing, because fears are never nothing, even when they're misfired. He listened to the whole thing. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me. I'm sorry for the sideways sharpness. I know." A pause. "I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. That's not a promise to the universe that I can't keep. Things happen. People are finite. I can't guarantee any specific future. But my intention, which is the part I can speak to, is not to go anywhere. And when I do take a trip for a weekend, I'll come back." Something small and embarrassing was happening behind my eyes. I blinked at the tablecloth. "I know that logically." "I know you know it logically," he said gently. "Logic isn't the department that's scared, though." I looked up at him. He was looking at me steadily the way he always did, that quality of presence that I had spent months finding suspicious, and had slowly come to recognize as simply the way he was with people he cared about. Fully there. "No," I said. "It's not." "So," he said, "we work on it. That's all. It's not a flaw to fix, it's just a thing we work on." We ordered dinner. He showed me his trip itinerary afterward, which was very like him, not to reassure me obsessively, but to simply include me in the information, to make it present and concrete rather than a shape in the dark. I pretended to be more interested in the restaurant logistics than the dates. He pretended not to notice me being more interested in the dates. This is what I mean by learning. This is the actual texture of it. In March, He went on his trip and came back on Sunday evening and texted me from the airport, and I went to my kitchen and made tea with a focus that was extremely transparent in its motivation. And when my phone buzzed with landed train in 40 minutes, I felt a specific variety of relief that I allowed myself to feel without commentary. By April, things had settled into a shape, a rhythm. It had, as most new rhythms do, taken the adjustments of the preceding months to arrive at, and it fit in the specific way that things only fit after you've worn them in. We still worked across from each other every day. This had been a concern I'd raised early. Could we maintain professional separation? Would it make things complicated? Were we setting ourselves up for a particular kind of awkward? And Gail had said, we're adults who both care about our work. I think we're fine. And we were, mostly. The asides were back, warmer now than they'd been before December. The coffee, the fox and the bear in his monitor, which he had told me the second name of, on a Friday afternoon with a studied casualness that was charming, precisely because it wasn't actually casual. Winston, he'd said. He'd named them after he'd started at Renwick, on a particularly difficult week when something hadn't worked out and he'd needed something that was just his and small and steady. I thought about that a lot. The need for things that are just yours and small and steady. I understood it completely in a way I'd never had the language for before. One Tuesday morning in April, he came in and set a small piece of paper on my desk. I looked at it. It was a printed photograph, very small, the size of a card, of the beach in winter, gray sky and white sand, and the specific emptiness of a beach in cold weather. I looked up at him. For your drawer, he said. Or not, if you don't want it. I just thought the beach in winter is something separately from the beach in summer. I thought you might like having both. He sat down and opened his laptop. I looked at the small picture for a long time. Then I opened my desk drawer and took out the face-down photo. The one of Daniel and me at 16 and 13, the summer one, warm sand and squinting eyes, and set it upright next to my monitor. I put the winter beach picture beside it. I didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. The office moved around us with its usual Tuesday morning hum, but he saw the photos upright when he glanced over, and I saw him see them, and something between us settled another degree into place. In May, we were in his apartment on a Saturday afternoon. This was now a regular thing. Saturdays had a shape that involved coffee in the morning, usually some kind of walking, and ending up in one or the other of our apartments in the afternoon with books or film or, increasingly, just the comfortable near silence of two people who had gotten somewhere together. His apartment was nothing like his desk. His desk was organized chaos. His apartment was just comfortable, full of books and a few plants and the accumulated objects of a life that had been lived with attention. The fox and bear were at home too, copies of the office ones, or maybe the originals I'd never asked. There was a painting on the wall above the sofa that I'd asked about the second time I'd been there, and he'd told me he'd found it at a market 3 years ago and bought it because it looked like somewhere he wanted to go, which was a sentence I thought about for days afterward. We were reading. He was on the sofa. I was on the floor with my back against the sofa and his hand resting loosely in my hair, which had started happening at some point without either of us naming it, the way good things sometimes start. I owe you a different apology, I said, to the room in general, not looking up from my book. A pause in the turning of pages. Which one? The first one. Not December. The first day, when you told me the fox's name and I said I wasn't asking. A quiet sound from above me. Not quite a laugh. You weren't asking. No, but you were just being warm, and I decided to be dismissive about it, and I've been thinking about that lately. His hand moved slightly in my hair. I knew you weren't ready. It was fine. It wasn't, though. You were just being yourself, and I stopped. I've spent a long time not trusting people who were just being themselves, because I couldn't figure out what they wanted, what the angle was. I didn't understand that some people are just warm, that it isn't strategy. A long pause. Then, what changed? I thought about it. The honest answer. You did, I said. You kept being consistently yourself for long enough that eventually I ran out of ways to explain it as strategy. You were just exactly what you looked like, and that was so unfamiliar that I didn't have a category for it for a really long time. Gale set down his book. I heard it. He leaned forward and looked down at me, and I looked up at him, and there was a quality to the afternoon light that I will not forget, that specific spring light through his windows, the kind that doesn't commit to anything dramatic but simply is warm and ordinary and entirely sufficient. For what it's worth, he said, you are also exactly what you look like, complicated and careful and quietly one of the most feeling people I've ever met. I knew that before I knew anything else about you. From the reports, I said. From the reports. A small, specific smile. You wrote about a novel once, I have it saved somewhere, and you said the prose did what the best prose does, which is show you the inside of a life so clearly that for a moment you forget it isn't yours. I thought whoever wrote this knows something real. I'd written that. I remembered writing it, late on a Friday, for a manuscript I'd loved and eventually recommended and which had been passed on anyway, which had been one of the genuinely disappointing days in that job. I had written it quickly, without revision, the way the honest things usually come. I didn't think anyone read those carefully. I read everything you write carefully. There was nothing to say to that. There was something so complete about it that adding to it would have been wrong, like talking over music. So I turned back toward the room and leaned into the sofa, and he leaned back into it too. And we stayed like that with the spring light and the books and the easy weight of the afternoon for a long time. I've been telling you the story with me at the center because it is my perspective, and I've only recently learned to trust my own perspective enough to lead with it. But I want to do something here. In the final part of this story that I couldn't have done at the beginning, I want to talk about how we were both wrong. The title of this is that I hated him first. He loved me first, and we were both wrong about each other. I've told you the hating part. I've told you about his loving first. The both wrong part is the part I haven't gotten to yet. I was wrong about Gail in the obvious ways, the ways I've already described. I thought the warmth was strategic. I thought the patience was a long game. I thought the kindness was a form of pressure. None of it was. He was simply a person who had decided that I was worth caring about and was acting accordingly, with no expectation of return and no hidden demand. I'd never encountered that before at close range. Or if I hadn't had the trust to recognize it. But here is the less obvious thing. The thing that Gale told me himself, on a night in June, in a conversation that surprised me. He had been wrong about me too. We were on the roof of his building. The building had a small roof terrace that was technically a common space, but that nobody used except him and one other tenant who had a herb garden up there. We'd taken up a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, and it was the kind of June evening that feels like a promise being kept after months of gray. He said, out of nowhere, the way he sometimes came to things, sideways, when you weren't expecting it, I thought I understood what was going on with you. Before December, I thought I could see the shape of it, and I was patient about it, and I thought that was enough. I didn't think about how it felt from inside it. I looked at him. What do you mean? I mean that I made you into something I was being patient about, a puzzle I was gently solving. And it's a kind of arrogance, actually. I was so sure I understood what you needed that I didn't ask. I waited, and I offered, and I was thoughtful about it. But I never just said, I see you struggling with something, and I would like to help if you want it. I performed patience without offering partnership, and I think that probably made some of it harder. I sat with this. I don't think I would have taken you up on the offer, I said finally. Even if you'd made it directly. Maybe not. But I should have made it anyway. He turned his glass in his hands. I was also afraid, a little, of being rejected plainly. The patience was partly genuine, and partly a way of not putting myself in the position where you could directly say no. This was new information. I had thought all that time that his patience was pure, simply who he was, undefended, without fear. Learning that there was fear in it too, a different shaped fear than mine, but fear nonetheless, was strange and somehow steadying. Like finding out that something you thought was perfect had a specific, small, visible crack in it, and that the crack made it more real and more yours. You're afraid of direct rejection, I said. I am not especially good at it, no. But you made yourself say something in December, in the office. Yes. A pause. It had been long enough, and you've been pulling away again, and I thought I would rather know than keep waiting. A quiet sound. It didn't go especially well. No, I said. I'm sorry. You've apologized. We've been past it. I know. I'm still sorry. He reached over and found my hand on the railing. We stood like that, watching the city below us in the June dark, the lights coming on street by street as the sky finished its slow darkening. We were both wrong, I said. Yes. And we were both afraid. Yes. And neither of us asked for what we actually needed. A pause. That's fairly accurate. I think that's probably the most ordinary thing about this, I said. About us. It's very ordinary, actually. What, the fear? The whole thing. Two people who couldn't quite say what they meant and had to find their way around to it sideways over several months. He glanced at me. Is that disappointing? I thought about it. The roof terrace and the lights and his hand over mine on the railing. The winter beach photo next to the summer one on my desk. The way Tuesday mornings had become something to look forward to. The 30 seconds on a January pavement when I had let something be real. No, I said. It's the part I'm proudest of, actually. That we got here sideways. That we had to. There are things I know now that I didn't know on my first day at Renwick Publishing, standing in a doorway deciding I didn't like someone whose laugh I hadn't even properly heard yet. I know that closed off is not the same as safe. I know that being seen accurately by someone is terrifying and necessary, and that the terror is not a sign it's wrong. I know that you can be wrong about someone so completely that the correction of it, the long, slow process of having to revise the entire picture, is itself a form of intimacy. I know that Gale takes his coffee with oat milk and 1 sugar, which I learned around week 6, and that he hates cilantro with a specificity that I find disproportionate and endearing. I know that he checks his phone for weather every morning, even though he can see the sky from his window, and the phone is always wrong anyway. I know that he named Theo and Winston in a difficult week because he needed something small and steady, and that I understand this in my bones. I know that real things can be lost. That was always true, and it will stay true. But here is the other thing. The thing I am still learning by practice rather than by understanding. Real things can also stay. Real things can accumulate. Real things can become the architecture of a life rather than its threat. The face-down photo is face-up now. I called Daniel last Sunday and we talked for 2 hours. Gale answered his phone in the background at one point and Daniel said, "Who's that?" And I said his name, and Daniel said the name back with the particular inflection of an older brother locating relevant information. And I didn't deflect or explain it away. I just said yes and let the conversation move. Small room, no longer. The door is open. The light is on. I hated him first. He loved me first. We were both wrong about each other, and then we were both honest about it, and then we built something out of the honesty. The way you build things. Imperfectly, carefully, one ordinary Tuesday morning at a time. It turns out that's more than enough.